Hello and welcome to the second podcast of Housing Geospatial, the podcast where we discuss anything and everything that relates to either housing or geospatial, preferably if there's a little bit of both. Housing Geospatial was formed as we believe place matters for social housing and that geospatial information is woefully underrepresented in the housing sector. This series is around sharing a collective knowledge within the housing sector. You can either find us on our LinkedIn page or feel free to head over to our website at www.housinggeospatial.co.uk. I'm your host, Chris Kinnear, and our guest for today is the brilliant Justin Chamberlin, who is the Head of Asset Management over at Raven Housing Trust. Hi, Justin. How's it going?
Yeah, very well, thanks. Not too bad at all.
Thank you very much for joining us. So I have to ask first, how did you get involved within housing and or geospatial?
Wow. Like most of us, I guess most housing professionals, I don't think anybody makes the choice to go into social housing. I ended up working in private lettings at the time and then found a job that was for Horsham District Council, made the application, became a housing officer. Believe it or not, that was about 30 years ago. I know I don't look old enough. So yeah, that's kind of how I got into social housing. And as a result of that, I've worked all over the place, from housing management, IT, asset management, repairs, pretty much every sector. The only department I've never worked in is the chief exec's department, which is fine. I haven't got a problem with that. But, generally I've worked pretty much across the business and across the sector as well. So, big RPs to smaller ones. And we all face the same challenges. It doesn't matter really. It's just a scale issue, if you like. As for geospatial, like many others, when I was working in Horsham, I got handed grounds maintenance spread over a 500 square mile geography. I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know how to manage it. There were many, many sites, and it was how am I going to deal with this? And as a result, I had a software. They had a GIS at the time called Data Map, which is very, very obsolete these days. And I started using that to manage grounds maintenance, just to understand where the sites were, what the square meterage was, etc., etc. And it evolved from those humble beginnings.
I mean, I think that's incredible. Loads of people I talk to when we talk about housing, a lot of people, like you said, stumble into it accidentally. So you said you were in private lettings before. So how did your career change into housing from private lettings?
So I was doing property management, so doing all the gas, all the repairs and that kind of stuff for private lettings along the south coast, which was a challenge actually, because you had private landlords all over the world, people in Hong Kong, etc., that had these properties that we were managing and offers a managed service for them at that time. And that's kind of where I got my bedrock, my understanding of compliance and all the legislative requirements around that, but in a private letting sector, so it was all commercial. And as I say, it was a case of then I saw a job at Horsham District Council at the time when they had the housing stock, and I applied for that, and I was lucky enough to get it. And I was a housing manager on the front line with an enormous patch. I think I had about 1,800 properties at the time, dealing with everything. It was generic officers, so dealing with repairs, ASB, rent arrears, etc. Pounding the streets, because at that time it was an old IBM mainframe system that we used. So, no mobile technology and all that kind of stuff. Really am dating myself here, aren't I? We had our rent statements were printed out on a dot matrix printer and handed to you, and you have to go through them line by line to check your arrears statements and that kind of stuff. And then it was a case of physically going around and visiting people. So that's where it started, and then it's evolved from there. So, from that perspective, I then moved into land management, which is where GIS came into my career. And then I moved into IT, business systems management, and then repairs and compliance, and subsequently became asset management. I worked in compliance across the business down for First Wessex, as it was then, specialising in GIS, and then from that perspective, on from there to repairs and compliance, and then into asset management after that. So, yeah, an interesting career choice, if you like. It's a bit of an interesting one, because I've actually got experience across the business, so you kind of know what the front end problems are from a housing management perspective, all the way through the IT challenges, all the way through to, maintaining the properties. I think I found my niche now, though. I like properties far more than I do IT systems and, that kind of stuff.
I think that's a good one. Like I can understand that one, but it sounds, I didn't quite realize it was such a myriad of different aspects within housing, which is fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it puts me in a bit of a unique place from that perspective because, having been the housing manager, the last person you want to see on your doorstep when you've got rent arrears, all the way up to managing a property portfolio of varying sizes. I mean, when I was working for Optivo Southern, it was 55,000 units, down to 22,000 at Tower Hamlets with completely different challenges. One's got lots of tower blocks, one hasn't necessarily. So it's an entirely different challenge. But ultimately, it's a real data-driven approach to how we manage asset management, as opposed to coming from a traditional surveyor's approach, if you like. It's leveraging the data that we hold to fill in the gaps, not only about the properties, but the people that occupy them. And I think that's a really important thing these days, particularly with the TSMs that have come in, etc., understanding the silence. And it's about understanding the people that occupy the properties so you can actually tailor your services to them. Not everybody wants the same stuff. I mean, we want a property portfolio that performs and is viable in the longer term, but ultimately the resident doesn't necessarily care about that. So it's being sensitive to that, I think, is quite important.
That's given me a whole host of things and a whole various different questions. If we have time at the end, I'll probably address some of those.
No worries.
So you were at Saxon Weald for a while. Can you tell us about why you moved there and what you were doing there, and chat to us about really your beginnings?
Yeah, so I was working for Horsham District Council, and they went through the large-scale voluntary stock transfer, which became Saxon Weald at the time. There's much debate as to why those things happened, but ultimately it's all about cash flow, isn't it, and reducing liabilities for local authorities. And at that point, I was a housing manager, but I quickly swiftly moved into land management. So they gave me the whole portfolio to manage in relation to understanding the land titles, understanding grounds maintenance, tree surveys, and all the other bits that go with it. And at that time, I was sitting in the asset management team, which kind of made sense. And I was building a GIS so that we could understand where all the properties were, and predominantly for the management of contracts. So I had grounds maintenance and tree management was sat with me, but also to understand all the little bits of land that we all seem to inherit that nobody really knows what to do with a view to disposing of them and actually streamlining the portfolio. So that was the other string, if you like. Most social housing property portfolios have been pocketed with RTB or RTB sales that have happened over the period of the life cycle of the portfolio. But invariably, there's little bits of land left all over the place that we still retain ownership for that actually have no value to you at all, other than a liability. So part of the process around that was identifying them and see if we could discharge them for nominal sums to the private owners in the vicinity, and therefore streamline the property portfolio. And actually, that elicited quite a lot of money in the end. We made about £250,000 out of that by just going through it systematically and slowly selling these bits of land. So it was part of that. And then grounds maintenance, as I said, I was handed the portfolio. Go and manage the grounds maintenance contract with no plans, no understanding of where all the portfolios were. This tiny garage site in the middle of nowhere that nobody ever visits, but has got masses of grass associated with it. Go and find that and manage it. And it came to me that there has to be a better way of doing this than driving around, spending hours driving in the cars between sites. And which is where this data map solution appeared. They had it, they bought it. It was kind of rudimentary data in it. And now I just leveraged that and moved on from that perspective, building up layers just to get an understanding of where and what was on site. And then from that perspective, started using the Esri solution, bought the Esri solution in-house. So that was Esri, it was ArcMap 3.1 at that time, so a long time ago. I'd started up building maps on that basis. And then land portfolio came into it. So we did the polygon searchlight, I think it was called, or searchlight polygons from land registry. So we brought that in. And then started building up the layers from that perspective, property points, garages, and all the other bits that go into start to populate that portfolio. Still being used, I believe. So that's like, God, 20 odd years ago. So, you know, once you get that base map being sorted out, it kind of sets you up because you get the foundations right, and then you can start leveraging stuff out of the back of it. But using grounds maintenance at that time, I mean, there's still case studies kicking around, if I recall. I think we saved in the region of 130, 150 grand managing the grounds maintenance using the GIS solution at that point. And I don't think anybody else was doing it at that time. It was quite, you know, the use of geospatial data within social housing at that time was really embryonic. It was really early days. And so it was a little bit different from that perspective. But that piqued my interest. And I'm still, you know, 20 odd years later, I'm still using GIS on a regular basis in my work now, working in asset management.
That's so 20 odd years ago. So between 2000 and 2005 was when you were at Saxon Weald, and
yeah, so I was at Saxon Weald from till 2012, I want to say. So I was there for about 12 years.
Okay.
Well, 2010, maybe 2010. Yeah.
So it seems, I mean, for me, like growing up with Geospatial, seems a bit late in the game for huge organizations with big properties to start thinking about kind of geospatial. But the fact that it seems you're quite innovative in that regard in the sector, thinking about spatial information.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's known. I think it's understood, if you like. The wheels turn quite slowly in social housing, and it takes a little bit of time for us to get on board with stuff. You know, at that time, nobody was really using GIS within social housing at all. There were very, very few people that were using it at all. So, you know, on that basis, it was quite difficult even finding support. And I remember speaking to Esri at the time, and they didn't have any housing clients. They had none at that point, or, you know, really few. And it was really difficult to actually strike up any kind of relationship with people to actually get some insight. And then I was working with Ordnance Survey quite closely. So there was a guy called Nick McCready who was the accounts manager, if you like, for social housing at that time. Worked with a lot of local authorities as well. And then he introduced me to a guy called Richard Tiley from MHS Homes. And that's kind of where we started to collaborate and started sharing ideas about what we can do. And I'll be honest, he came from a way more academic background than I did, way smarter than me. From my perspective, it was like fumbling through the tools and trying to work out how it worked. Thankfully, I've got enough of a logical brain that I can actually work it and come up with, you know, all the setups for the geodatabases that you needed at that time, or shapefiles or what have you. And that's kind of where it started to evolve. And from that perspective, we then sort of got in touch with people like Alex Hill and various Andy Bradley at that time as well from, I want to say Asted, but I think that's wrong. I think he was over at Sovereign at that time. And we started to build a little bit of a community around that, just sharing information, because there wasn't many people using it at all. And then looking at case studies from the US, because obviously GIS was really being used by USGS at that point in time, and just looking at what they were doing around mapping land parcels and that kind of stuff, and trying to bring it into the English environment, if you like, within social housing. But there were very, very few people that were sort of dabbling in that arena, and ended up doing a few case studies and speaking at conferences with Ordnance Survey, with the view to actually getting it onto people's agendas more than anything else. But it was always quite amusing because you'd be able to talk about stuff at exec meetings and what have you, But when you produced the picture with a map with the problem on it, people immediately clicked. They kind of knew what it was. And I think, there is that adage, a picture speaks 1,000 words, but it really does when you're talking about land ownership and grounds maintenance and that kind of stuff that you can actually model. And it started to make sense, and it started to build traction on that basis. I had a bit of a revelation at one point as well when I was sort of early days of using it, is that you can map properties, but you can also map people to the properties. And that kind of, for me at that moment in time, was like, hang on, there's real value in this. We can actually start using it to get some business insight, as to how we move forward with it. So yeah, started doing stuff around fuel poverty indicators. So taking building components and assets about buildings and people information and joining them together and starting to understand where we're going to have problems around elderly, vulnerable people living in pretty poor accommodation and fuel poverty. So that was quite an interesting moment. And we still do it now, let's be honest. I don't think that's nothing. It's not new these days, and that's the kind of stuff that we do. But at that time, it was quite a big thing.
That's genuinely, like, obviously, we've spoken in the past about this. I know about all this. However, hearing it like this, it's quite mad. Like not mad, but like really interesting and fascinating. And I'm glad to see that tide has changed. So you were talking a huge bit about collaboration. Now, you're one of the founding members of GI for Housing. Can you tell us, so obviously collaboration was a huge part of that beginnings. Can you tell us a bit more about how you began it and why, and how you went about doing it?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, there was about 4 or 5 of us, and we were doing presentations for Ordnance Survey. So they were putting on roadshows and trying to get housing engaged, if you like, in that environment. The software providers weren't so interested at that time, but obviously Ordnance Survey were interested in selling their data. There weren't the multiple resellers of data at that point. It was like you go direct to Ordnance Survey, and that's how you get your data. And obviously social housing providers at that time weren't able to leverage the public sector mapping agreement, so they're outside of that. So it's commercial, you had to buy it. And clearly Ordnance Survey at that point were very interested in building up a customer base for their products that was different from telecoms or builders or infrastructure, etc. And this is right at the outset of master maps, so it's a long time ago. So they're selling master map, and they started to approach social housing providers that were using that data, me being one of them. And we ended up going to a number of conferences in London and Bristol, and I met these people I mentioned. So Richard Tidy, Alex Hill, Andy Bradley, and a few others. And then it came to, I was chatting with Richard one day. I said, we should do this ourselves. We could actually put a hub together where we have best practice and examples of what you can do with GIS to make it easier for other RPs, because we felt we're all in the same boat. And actually, if you don't understand your land holdings, how can you have a property business? It didn't make sense. If you didn't know where your properties were, how can you manage them effectively? And it was just, if we can give examples and best practice of how we can do this and work collaboratively, because we're all in the same boat, that's got to be a good idea. And the concept of GI for Housing came about, and then people came on board. God, this is about 2008, I think it is, about that time. And it was featured in Housing Technology magazine and bits and bobs, and we had articles. I think there was an article in Inside Housing at one point as well about us doing this back in the day, as they say. And it kind of took off. We had a conference. We did a conference up in Leicester where we had quite a few people attend, and it kind of developed from that perspective. But it was laborious, Chris, I'll be honest with you, because managing it at that time via websites and what have you, we didn't have the infrastructure that we do now, if you know what I mean. So we didn't have, the technology wasn't the same. And so the overhead from the management perspective was quite difficult. But we tried to set up forums. We had a website set up. We had a LinkedIn group, etc. And trying to build traction. But as with all these things, people go off and do other jobs, don't they? And actually, if you haven't got a succession plan in place, it's quite difficult to maintain it. And I guess it ran for about, I want to say about 10 years, give or take, and then it kind of petered out a little bit, I think. But yeah, it was a good time. It was an interesting experience to get ideas from other people working with the same problems, but coming at it from a different approach. So it's really quite collaborative from that perspective.
Well, in truth, GI for Housing inspired Housing Geospatial. Because I joined Housing in 2018, there wasn't much sort of around me because L&Q had only just kind of begun its journey, really. And then seeing GI for Housing and sorting out conferences and talking with each other about ideas. And yeah, like you said, that's kind of petered off. And that's why we've got this product now, which is awesome. Yeah. So at the moment, like earlier on, you talked about at Raven, how you're using Geospatial. Can you give a quick overview about how you're using Geospatial at Raven?
Yeah, sure. So, like many others, we have our base mapping, with all the red lines on it and the property points and the grounds maintenance and the garages and what have you. So that's a real base level that pretty much everybody in the organisation has access to. It's kind of a weird one because I've actually worked with Raven Housing before, so as a business systems manager a long time ago, and I actually built the GIS, and I came back about 2.5 years ago as the head of asset management, and the GIS is still here. So it was quite bizarre coming back and finding the stuff that you built in the first place is still being used. But that speaks about its value, I think. It underpins the fact that it is used on a day-to-day basis. I got followed by one of the repair surveyors today who was saying, I was looking at the GIS and it says this just today. So, the very fact that it's being used at that level to inform decisions is quite interesting. And it obviously constitutes a day-to-day value for those transactional processes that everybody has to go through. Do we own it? Where's the boundary, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one level. But then we do extend it slightly, particularly in the asset management area. So we're looking at using GIS for efficiencies, bringing geography into our program formulation, so you're minimising prelims and overheads and that kind of stuff from contractors, trying to make it a bit more holistic in relation to the synergy of works, i.e. if you've got a layer with kitchens and bathrooms, you've got a layer with windows or roofing, it's about how you coordinate that so you're actually minimising the disruption to residents as much as possible, making it streamlined. Nobody likes having a builder in their house. So if you can minimise that impact, that's got to be a good thing. Classically, within the asset management world, when the Decent Homes funding was around, it was a case of cherry picking properties. So you'd ended up with half a street being done here and quarter of a street being done there, etc. So now we're trying to streamline that significantly now in relation to a much more coordinated and holistic approach, so we can minimise the disruption for residents. And doing that with GIS is brilliant because you can actually see it on a map and then you can share it with those people. So there's an element of that, but also looking around energy efficiency, net carbon zero, capital investment, net present values, what part of the property portfolio is viable and what isn't viable from the long term, taking it from a real cold asset management perspective, literally looking at the bricks and mortar and what is the value of those properties, and disregarding to some degree the social value that does come in, because there are those properties. Everybody's aware there's a massive housing need. I know that for Reigate and Banstead Council, they've got an enormous waiting list, but actually some of those properties aren't suitable. They're actually going to lead to, you might have a roof over your head, but it's leaking and it's riddled with damp and mold, etc., etc. So in certain instances, disposal of properties is probably a better solution, and then you can ring fence that to bring it back into other properties, investment into other properties. I was doing some quite interesting stuff the other day, actually, looking at average SAPs. So you look at the private sector at the moment, the average stat for score for a private sector is about 66. The social housing, it's 70 plus. And it made me think for a second. We're clearly investing in our properties way more than we necessarily consider, because from an asset management perspective, I always think net carbon zero, we've got so much work to do to bring these properties up to standard. But actually, if the average across the sector is 70, 71, it's not as bad as you first think. So it's quite interesting from that perspective.
So is that private rented or just private generally?
Private generally, 66.
Oh, yeah. So private, I think, private, because I was reading something else the other day about a private rented sector is
Probably
about
less than that.
Well, I heard it's about a C already. I was reading. Granted, it was the Times, which is a bit pro landlord, but they were saying that their average homes was about a C-ish.
Yeah, so I was looking. I had quite a lot of presentation to do for the board recently, so I did quite a lot of research on that, and I did see it was around 66 versus 70 odd. I think this was on the .gov website as well. So, if I recall, I need to cite my sources now. I was quite surprised. I really was quite surprised. But we do quite a lot of it in that space. So using geospatial data for those kind of indicators, if you like, to bringing all those disparate data sets together, give us a holistic picture of the portfolio or specific areas of the portfolio. I did quite a lot of work on complex property, those ones that give me a headache from an asset management perspective. So, bringing a lot of the history together and actually trying to map them and understand what the social evolution of areas has been as well, because that gives you a bit of context. I found out recently that one of our sites that is problematic, it's post-war, like most social housing, 4.4 million properties built between the end of the Second World War and 1965. That was when social housing was really driven. And as a result of that, most of the portfolios of most social housing is quite aged. We've got about 52% of our portfolio comes from that period, and obviously has those kind of endemic problems that are built in that kind of architecture. Nonetheless, I was looking at this estate and I discovered that in 1994, there was a tower block in the middle of this estate that was demolished. You'd have no idea unless you were dragging through all these websites and trying to find the history of this kind of stuff. So that was quite interesting. I'm quite glad it's not there anymore, because it would have been a real headache. But at the same time, I have no contact, no idea at all. But once you know that, you can understand why the properties have been put together from that perspective. So it's quite interesting. I like to bring that in to some of the mapping that we do, so you get a context. I've been doing quite a lot of stuff around flood mapping for our finance team, looking at where the flood risk is in adjacent to our properties, so that we can look at the insurance requirements on that. But on the flip side of that, I've also been doing quite a lot of work with Surrey County Council around local flooding that's affecting our properties, and mapping where the properties are in specific areas, but also the customer references of flooding. So you can actually then work with other agencies as well. So that's quite interesting. So it's diverse, to say the least.
That's awesome to hear how widespread it is. Now, obviously, earlier on, you talked about when you were at Saxon Wild, you were able to save 130 to 150 grand a year through your contract management. You've spoken a lot about how asset management in like your particular department, how much you're using geospatial to understand your assets and to be more efficient and everything else. At the moment within Raven, where do you believe your greatest return on investment with using geospatial is?
Wow, that's a question. I honestly still think it's within the grounds maintenance sector and the street furniture stuff, because it's tangible. That's the way I describe it, it's the bit outside the garden gate. Yeah. So your housing management, you've got all your properties, you know where your properties are in your housing management system, you've got your tenancies, you're managing your rent transactions and your repairs, etc., on the properties. It's the bits outside the garden gate that you can't quantify in that kind of system. So capturing those from a housing management perspective or from a contract management perspective is the way to understand and expose it. And it's been vital using that kind of mapping for re-tendering processes and understanding the evolution of stuff, evolution of green space, if you like, over time. So that's, I think, from that perspective, it's really where you get the most value for money, quantifiable value for money, if you like. Cash in, cash out. I think there is massive value in the stuff we do within the asset management team, just trying to understand properties, net present value, and how they're performing. But that's less quantifiable because it's caught up with, social housing in use, valuation, market valuations, and all that kind of stuff. So it's slightly less tangible from a cashable perspective. But there's definitely value in it. And the very fact that it's used by pretty much everybody in the organisation on a day-to-day basis to check ownership, to check whether we own the property, etc. There's obviously a value in that because you're not then searching through systems to understand whether you own it, whether you don't own it. Where's the picture? You can actually just go straight to the GIS to see. Makes it damn so easier from that perspective. It's always nice. It's always nice to be collared by somebody and say, "I've looked at the GIS," and that's really good.
Oh, that must be a glorious feeling knowing someone's gone to your creation. That was always one challenge I've met with housing associations, where a lot of the times geospatial supports a lot of efficiencies. It stops because it's such a big connector of data and systems to visualize it on a map. Actually, you don't have to go through 20 things to understand, is that your home? Is it at risk to flood? Is there, in this home, do you need 2 people to go and visit? All those sorts of things.
Absolutely, all that kind of indicators. Yeah, they're vital. So, I mean, we talked at one point, I'd actually linked the housing management system to the GIS. So you clicked on the property point and it took you into the housing management system for that record. And I found that people were using that more than they were going into the front end of the housing management system because it gave them an immediate visual representation of where it was without having to search for an address or a person. And that was quite a nice thing to get to that point. So you actually use the GIS as a way into the housing management system as opposed to the other way round. So that was quite a nice feeling at that moment. I've won. People have understood the power of GIS, so it was quite interesting from that perspective.
The sheer usability, like the fact they're going in through a GIS to go into a housing management. I think anyone listening hopefully picks up on that idea and uses it to really support their rollouts, or at least gets them thinking about their own systems.
Absolutely. I mean, for me at that time, when you think about it, when that was being developed, when the GIS was being developed, there was no Google Maps. There was none of that. You didn't have aerial photography. You couldn't go into Google and look at Google Maps and find a property. It didn't exist. So, at that point, that's quite a revelation that people could look at aerial photography that you got from Ordnance Survey and see a picture of the property from the air, or see a property point and access your housing management system. But that point, that didn't happen. It wasn't rolled out in the UK. So it was, from that perspective, it was quite an eye-opener, if you like. It did make it quite difficult explaining what GIS was because it wasn't on your phone. You didn't have it, it wasn't available. So you weren't exposed to it at that level. To try to explain what GIS is to executive when I'm trying to fund this at the time was quite difficult.
Yeah, I've been in that thing. We're trying to get $2,000 out of one for some data, and it's like, nah, not vital.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
Actually, when you show them something they find is useful, and I mean, I was 2018, 2020 with those challenges. I dread to think what it was like in the early 2000s with those challenges.
Again, nobody had any idea what it was. I'll be honest with you, they really didn't have any concept of what it was. And it was only once you showed them what you were actually doing that it kind of the penny dropped, if you know what I mean. But it was a different way of seeing data. It was a different way of visualizing your property portfolio, as opposed to the reams of spreadsheets that we've all come to know and love.
Yeah. We've got one last question. So you're doing loads of stuff with geospatial at Raven at the moment. You've got a huge amount of kind of backstory with using it. If you kind of had unlimited budget or any, like, what if you could choose a project, what kind of project would you like to see geospatial being used for at Raven?
Wow. Okay. I honestly think more distributed analysis, so more specialism, if you like, to make better data-driven decisions. I mean, I think there's been a change within the sector, particularly with asset management. It's all about data. It's all about knowing your properties, but it's also about knowing your residents as well. So, how you manage ASB, how you collect that information, how you can effectively resolve those kind of social pressures, if you like, within the portfolio, understanding where the hotspots are, and just bringing more of that data together, more of the specialisms that are spread out across the organisation together to resolve the pressing problems of the people that live in your portfolio. I mean, that's what it's about. It's about social purpose. I mean, the reality is you don't go and work in social housing to make loads of money. It's about having a social impact. And actually, I think we can leverage it way more within that geospatial environment to tackle it, but also joining up with other people. Most social landlords have blinkers on, if you like, in relation to this is what we own, this is what we manage. But actually, there must be opportunities for collaboration because your properties overlap, and we never manage to share that information effectively. Or we're very close-lipped about what we own and what we don't own in that respect. But if you know that you've got an intersection of your estate with somebody else's estate, you're both suffering the same problem. So join it together and you can actually tackle it together and it make more sense. And similarly, local authorities sharing data, and county councils from that matter. So, one of the revelations for me, as I said to you recently, was about getting the adopted carriageways out of the county councils to bring into the local system so that we could actually see it. That was quite a revelation at the time because it just meant it was a one-stop shop to answer the questions. So doing a lot more around that, more collaboration from that perspective. One version of the truth, that's got to be the best place to be, if you like, because it answers so many more of the questions at the very first point of contact as opposed to making people wait days and days and days to get an answer. So yeah, that kind of stuff, I think.
Okay, so there's three really key insights there. Make it resident community focused, having collective understanding of different stocks and collaboration with other organizations, and then finally that one version of the truth, that master data knowledge.
Yeah.
And I think that's three key tenets which loads of us within social housing would probably agree with, actually.
Yeah, I don't see why there's always been a bit of a barrier, obstacles to sharing data, and it always struck me as a little bit odd. And it comes to finding the GIS person within the organisations. They tend to be on the same level. We'll share the data. We've got no issues about sharing the data. We can do that. There's no GDPR issues because most of it's in the public domain, and actually it makes a synergy of services. But you actually have to get through the bureaucracy to actually be able to achieve that. And I found that with county councils. That's the worst environment in the world to try and get data out. So it's quite an interesting
I think
perspective.
Council one could be a podcast in itself.
Yeah, probably could.
We'll
the other one, Chris, is exposing the data to residents. So actually having a means for people to interrogate what works are going to be done on their property using a mapping interface, because everybody knows about it now. So you can find your property on Google Maps. You can find your property on any mapping system. So what works are we going to done? What's your rent? All that kind of stuff. FRAs, what have it. So yeah, I think the app's customer focused environment again. Anyway, I talk too much.
No, not at all. I think, there's loads of stuff you've talked about. I think we could take huge sections and make a whole other podcast at it. But just to say thank you so much for your time today. It's been absolutely fantastic having you on. To everyone else, hope you've enjoyed this listen. If you've got any other topics you'd like to talk about, feel free to send us a message, and hopefully we'll make a topic on what you're interested in. Other than that, catch you next time. Thank you very much, everyone.
Cheers, Chris.